Welcome to Emphasis Added, a podcast by the Houston Law Review about legal issues, prominent lawyers, and the study and practice of law. I'm Matt Chelf.
And I'm Brock Jones. We're your hosts, and thanks for joining us.
We're joined here today by University of Houston Law Center professor Kellen Zale to discuss various land use issues affecting our local Houston community. Professor Zale teaches courses focused on land use, real estate, property, and local government here at the Law Center, and her scholarship on these topics has been published in the Stanford, Penn, Harvard Environmental, and various other law reviews.
Professor Zale has also been featured in the Austin American-Statesman and The Hill. And prior to her teaching career, she practiced at Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher, working primarily on real estate transactions and land use issues. Professor, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to talk today about land use issues that are presenting themselves in the Houston community. So first, when we say land use, can you tell our audience what exactly we're talking about?
Yeah, so it's almost, self-explanatory. It's how we use our physical built environment. And so it's the laws. Most people think automatically of zoning when they think of land use, but land use is a number of other laws. It's laws about historic preservation. It's laws about design and architectural features of buildings. It's laws about infrastructure and potentially, flooding related building requirements, sidewalk requirements or standards. So it's, think of the physical built environment of any city or suburb or town or rural community even, and, what we do with our land.
Awesome. So as you mentioned, kind of the maybe primary land use tool, or the one that most people think about first, is zoning. But since we're going to do this episode through a Houston lens, what makes Houston special when it comes to zoning in particular?
So yeah, Houston is the textbook example. Even non-lawyers often know this, that Houston is the biggest city in America without zoning. And sometimes there are, photos on the internet of odd pieces of a street or parts of a street where you might see, a dry cleaner next to a exotic adult store next to a, apartment building. And people are like, Houston has no zoning. You'd never see this in another city. And that may or may not be true, because sometimes the lines of zoning can end up in a way that you might actually see something like that in another city, but it does lend itself to that. Houston doesn't separate uses in the way that zoning does. It doesn't separate out, this is a residential area, this, square set of blocks, and this next square set of blocks is a industrial area, and this next area is office, et cetera, et cetera. So that is unique. Again, there are smaller cities that also don't have zoning, but Houston really is the standout city for having no zoning. And we don't have it because of a charter provision in our city charter that requires voters, if we ever were to adopt zoning, the voters of Houston have to approve it. And there's been three elections over the past 50 or so years, and it's come close, but it's never topped 50%. So I don't think there's any move to have another referendum vote anytime soon, because folks seem to feel like the city's working okay with our other land use rules.
Sure.
Interesting. So with Houston's reign as, the largest city in America without zoning laws, and Houston voters repeatedly striking down votes to implement that kind of legal action, has Houston's lack of zoning affected the orderly planning of infrastructure, such as the placement of homes and businesses, like you said?
So, again, folks seem to feel okay with Houston not having zoning. There, noticeably has been some effect in some of these places I mentioned where you might see an odd streetscape of unusual uses next to each other. In the kind of literature and the academic point of view, there's often a thought that it actually has advantaged the city in certain ways, because the market can kind of dictate where land uses go. Again, there's still land use regulation, but because there's not that other layer of zoning regulation that you would see in cities, that maybe uses go to the most efficient place that they might be otherwise prohibited from going because of zoning. So that can be a pro. The con is that can sometimes result in uses because zoning is supposed to separate incompatible uses. So that can sometimes result in uses that are somewhat or very incompatible being sited next to each other. And so You can think of this in different ways. You can see examples of this where there's, a concrete plant right next to a apartment building, and concrete plants or another heavy industrial facility have pollution concerns and things like that. And we might not want that to happen, but we don't have zoning to prevent it. There may be other ways to stop that through the laws of nuisance or other types of governmental regulations. But that can be the downside of not having zoning, is that you have the tendency or possibility of incompatible uses next to each other.
Definitely.
Close.
So, Professor, you recently co-authored an amicus brief about the historic preservation ordinance adopted by the City of Houston. What does a historic preservation designation do?
So it, again, almost self-explanatory in the name, it designates areas or potentially just single properties, but usually areas as historic. And many, many cities in the United States have them, and they've had them for decades and decades. As cities have recognized that these potentially historic properties or areas were vulnerable to being demolished, and the historic value being lost, and the cultural value of both the aesthetics and the cultural associations with it being lost. And so these historic preservation ordinances put in place requirements for owners of these properties to get approval before they make certain external changes to the building. It's usually focused on the external because that's the part that has the historic value. And they usually have a possibility of an exemption for hardship, meaning like if there are extenuating circumstances where an owner really cannot afford, or certain other circumstances, you may be able to potentially make those external changes or even potentially demolish the building. But usually they have pretty high standards before they allow that. So it's a level of governmental review to kind of keep that as a possibility, but basically try to avoid that, try to preserve the historic cultural significance.
So it kind of operates as, an analog to zoning within the historic context?
Yeah, so again, many cities who have zoning also have their historic preservation ordinance. Houston's unique because, as we talked about, Houston doesn't have zoning, but it does have a historic preservation ordinance. And so it's a separate standalone but related concept.
Good deal. So there's recently been a proposal to create an additional tool called a conservation district. How would a conservation district differ from a historically protected district?
So these have been around for a little while, but I've only recently kind of heard of them, through discussions with y'all, in fact. And essentially they seem to be historic preservation light, we might call them. They are designed to accomplish some of the same goals, like protect aesthetics and or cultural values in a particular community that may be at risk for that being lost, either because of demolitions or changes to the neighborhood. And it appears that unlike historic preservation ordinances, they aren't tied to like the properties being categorized as having like a particular historic value, and that they tend to not have necessarily as high of a, initial requirement for the community that's going to designate itself as such a district to agree to the district. So often historic preservation districts, like a certain percentage of property owners have to agree to create the district, and it's often a supermajority of those, whereas conservation districts have or the ones that I have seen have a lower requirement of property owners agreeing to become part of this district, meaning they're agreeing to some restrictions on their property, but it's a lower threshold for agreeing to do so because the restrictions aren't going to be quite as arduous or intense as the ones that in a historic preservation.
Good deal. That makes a lot of sense.
And the idea is because they're not necessarily going to have as arduous or as high of a bar for the types of repairs or maintenance or rules about external changes, the property owners who live in these conservation districts won't necessarily have to spend as much to live in that district to maintain it to the standards of the conservation district, because the standards they're there, but they're not as you point out, as expensive to maintain.
Sure.
That's the idea.
Awesome. So pivoting a little bit, for years now, the Texas Department of Transportation, TxDOT, has been working on a plan to enlarge a large chunk of I-45 from north of Beltway 8 down through downtown and a little bit south. Here in Houston, And they've said the expansion is necessary. When 45 was laid out, Houston had like 2 million people in the greater area. Now it's close to 8 million people in the greater metropolitan area. So they're hoping it'll ease congestion, and they have numbers that it'll, improve pollution because it'll reduce idling times, and it should help with some flooding concerns, et cetera. Activist groups have seen the expansion in a different light. It's going to impact some local communities. It'll take away some public housing projects, as well as some of the transit-facing apartment buildings, et cetera. And those activist groups have succeeded in stalling the project a number of times. But in December, so late last year, the city and TxDOT executed a memorandum of understanding that's going to allow the project to move forward with kind of set criteria for how to address some of these concerns. One of those major concerns, like I said, is that in order to expand, TxDOT's going to have to level a bunch of stuff next to the freeway, and that people live there and have businesses there. So do they have that authority? And if so, kind of how do they go about that?
So yes, they do have the authority. This is the classic example of a government entity, because TxDOT is a government entity at the state level, needing to make believing it needs to make a public improvement for public use, literally public use. And so under the Fifth Amendment and the equivalent in the Texas Constitution, they have the authority to exercise eminent domain, which means that they will be required to pay those owners of the property whose property they decide that they, through their plans, need to take to expand the highway. And the owners have very little recourse in terms of saying, like, no, you don't have that authority, because they have the authority. The owners have some recourse in contesting how much they are paid. And this is often a fairly disputed issue in many types of highway expansion, like how much the government might come in with what's considered a lowball offer for the fair market value, and the property owner is going to have their appraisers come in with, maybe a higher than, expected value, and they're going to try to meet. Mm-hmm. They're going to try to meet somewhere.
Sure. Now, in that memorandum, TxDOT committed to pay relocation expenses both for homeowners, like you've been talking about, and we have the battle of the appraisers there, but as well as renters. And is that typical in these situations?
No, that's actually unusual. So I think that was one of the concessions because this is, as you pointed out, has been something that's being discussed and negotiated over several years. And so that is unusual. Normally, renters do not get compensation. Their landlord would get compensation when the building is taken, but the renters, like, they even if they have 11 months left on their 12 months lease, like, they don't get compensation for that. They don't have to pay those 11 months because they're forced to move, but they just have to move. Courts generally do not give that. So I think that is unusual, and that is one of the points that TxDOT would point to, saying, like, we're being quote unquote good neighbors here and doing more than we're legally required to do.
Yeah. And I've heard that some of those payouts for the renters have not been insubstantial. Wow. So that's a pretty major win for the community activists in that regard. Another hurdle for the project has been kind of its potentially disproportionate impact on low-income communities. The proposed expansion would result in demolishing 2 public housing communities, Clayton Homes and Kelly Village, which combined contain a total of more than 450 affordable housing units. So how can a citizen challenge a proposed development on the basis that it has a disproportionate impact on one portion of the community? Like, what legal theories would that rest on?
So it's difficult for a citizen. Nonprofit groups are typically the ones who work with the citizens to do this, although it's theoretically possible for a citizen. And a nonprofit coalition has challenged this as violating federal civil rights laws.
Sure.
Because of that disproportionate impact on protected classes under that federal civil rights law, which is the low-income communities. Many of them happen to be communities of color as well, and so race and ethnicity get tied in here, because this is it's the project run by TxDOT, but this federal civil rights law applies because TxDOT is going to get federal money, so the federal civil rights laws apply. So there is a complaint that was filed, I think, in 2021 or 2020, separate from like the Houston and the Harris County issues, that was filed by a coalition of nonprofits like the Air Alliance of Houston and others on those grounds. The status of it is unclear to me because the memorandum of understanding you mentioned doesn't include them as a party, these nonprofits that filed the lawsuit. So I believe their lawsuit is still kind of a pending issue that needs to be worked through. It is mostly, how shall I say? It's a most likely the lawsuit will be a tool for those groups to essentially get TxDOT to pay more attention to these issues, not a tool to stop the project. So, right? So that's kind of the idea behind the tool, because the civil rights violations that are alleged are also tied into the NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, which again requires these agencies doing these types of projects to go through an environmental impact report and identify some of these, disproportionate impacts, but it doesn't require them to substantively make changes necessarily to the project as a result to it. Just to identify that, and then hopefully by identifying that, the public's more aware, and then we have some political, like we've seen and talked about, political pushback and more awareness of this from TxDOT to make some changes to its project.
Sure. Yeah. So their surveys, they identify where problems could be. That leads to some public awareness. That leads to citizen engagement, and the citizen engagement just leads to some leveraging where they say, TxDOT says this is going to look really bad.
Public comment procedures. And,
absolutely.
The works.
Exactly.
And notably, that memorandum seems to say, and I don't exactly, I'm kind of with you, I don't know how this will pan out in real life, but they commit in the memorandum to replacing all 450 of those public housing units. We'll talk a little bit later in the episode about why that might be more difficult done than said. But it does look like, at least on this front end, that they've identified that that's going to be an issue, and they're going to try and alleviate those concerns somehow.
And I know the expansion project has also been challenged on environmental grounds. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the argument's being made there?
So that is again, NEPA, which is the abbreviation for the National Environmental Policy Act.
I'm in energy law and policy
okay,
right now, so we're doing all the pipeline version of that.
So that's it. So that is a tool. It applies to, and again, this is a project run by TxDOT, but it's TxDOT using federal funding, and so NEPA applies, and it's a requirement essentially to. It's a procedural law, so it's saying like, when you're going to engage in these big projects that may adversely affect the environment, broadly defined, government agencies have to produce these reports. And again, the idea behind the reports is that through this procedural mechanism, you kind of get engagement through leveraging. The federal law is not going to require that TxDOT actually like do X, Y, or Z as a result of this procedural requirement, but by going through the procedure and having to have a report that says, yeah, air pollution is going to go up this much or down this much, whatever the report finds, and flooding is going to change this much or this much, the different categories. That report's out there, and then the groups become aware of it. We use that as you said, leverage essentially to get changes to the project to try to mitigate some of those adverse environmental impacts.
And I guess as a procedural law, the operation of the procedure can be challenged, right? Like the adequacy of the reports. Exactly.
So part of it can be, part of the nonprofit's lawsuit may relate to that, saying that when TxDOT went through NEPA and went through this process, it did certain procedural parts wrong, so it needs to redo those and do it over again. And again, that provides more time for negotiation, because again, TxDOT at the end of the day is still probably going to say, yep, okay, we'll redo it, but we're going to come to the similar result, and project needs to be built. But that time gives the parties more time to negotiate.
Absolutely. So adjusted for inflation, median household incomes rose in Harris County by 4.83% between 2016 and 2021, with the median cost of housing rising over 22% and a county population increase of over 250,000 people in the same period. It is clear from those numbers that there is a need for more affordable housing in the city. However, no public housing communities and only one mixed-income apartment community has been built here since 2011. With bipartisan support for funding, why are low-income housing projects so difficult to implement?
That is the million-dollar question for not just Houston, every city. There are a lot of reasons. I don't even know where to start. One of the biggest is it's complicated. Building low-income housing from the developer side. Housing's expensive to build, as you point out. Inflation's making it even more expensive. So developers of low-income housing need to build. They have a complicated financing agenda before they even try to go through the government, like zoning regulations and land use regulations. Like just on the financing, they are pulling together a lot of different pieces, especially for bigger projects. Projects with 100 of units or more, even 50 units or more, and so that building that financing takes time, and some of those pieces can fall out during the time that it takes to kind of put together all those pieces of financing, because some of it involves federal programs, some of it involves state programs for financing, some of it is private financing sources, grant financing sources, and then separately from the financing, once they think they have the financing in place, then they have to get the needed approvals from the government that the local government they're building the project in, and so then that puts them into the land use approval process, and then we get into on that end, why is it so hard to build? And that is, again, million-dollar question. But land use law in general has intentionally built in a lot of public participation. Like that's often a pro of the land use process. You get people to contribute. Like, what do we want our built environment to look like? We have a lot of public hearings, a lot of opportunity for public input. But at the same time, that means that that involves a lot of opportunity for public opposition. And elected officials, or the appointed officials who respond to elected officials, they want to get reelected usually. They don't want to anger their constituents. So when they hear a lot of opposition at these public hearings for the new project, they take that back to their office, and they might have a vote based on that.
Sure. So a Texas law passed in 2015, pretty little fanfare about it. I think it kind of went right through, designed to bolster our affordable housing supply. It's going to allow a developer to remove a multifamily property from the tax rolls if that developer commits to making some of the units in that development affordable housing. That seems like a great solution to Brock and I. So could you tell us about what that program and if it's worked?
So yeah, it does sound like a great solution. And on paper, as you point out, it wasn't much fanfare, but initially I think groups that are in favor of affordable housing kind of were like, maybe this will work. The problem, as you pointed out, is that the incentive that the developer gets as a result is that they don't have to pay property taxes, for the whole project, and I don't know if it's time limited, but at least is there? I'm
not under the impression that it's time limited.
So it might be a permanent tax, cut for the developer owner, and they only have to make some of the units in the project affordable, and they don't have to make them affordable to the lowest level of affordability. And so I think some of the criticism that's arisen is that essentially the law is giving developers a tax break, which is our tax collectively, the state of Texas's tax dollars. We're not getting that, but they're getting a lot. Like, they don't have to necessarily make that many units affordable, and the ones that they do make affordable under that law don't have to be at the level of affordability but where Texas most needs units, which is like the lowest levels. Like, a lot of these are more like workforce housing type, which is important. We do need that, but in Texas, that's not our biggest need for housing. We tend to need more of that level of affordability for folks who are closer to the poverty line.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Yeah. The city recently announced plans to move forward with a number of projects under this same law. I think 13 of these mixed income, we'll call them developments, But residents of a couple of different neighborhoods, Tanglewood being one of them, medium income above $175,000, promptly complained. I think the story went out on the Chronicle saying that Houston was moving forward with the developments, and maybe the next day there was is when the uproar started, and the mayor has since paused all of these projects. So. Do you know anything about kind of what that complaint might look like?
So as we were talking about the affordable housing, once it gets to that part where the public, because part of land use is having lots of public hearings, even in Houston where we don't have zoning, public hearings, public input. And, many community members, when they hear affordable housing, they are concerned about impacts such as like traffic, noise, parking, congestion of the streets, too many new users using water lines that aren't being built up, or sewer lines, or things things that are actually impacted by development. So they're legitimately concerned about that, and they do want that. They often voice that concern, and cities try to explain how they are responding to that. Like, maybe we're expanding the sewer lines, maybe we're going to charge the developer a certain amount per new unit to help accommodate the fact that they're building more in this here, so we'll build a parking garage, things like that. However, they're often, the neighboring homeowners are often called not in my backyard homeowners, because they're like, we want affordable housing in the city, we know it's important, but we don't want it in our backyard. And so there are also less explicit concerns associated with that, which are often related to, bias related to the wealth of these people coming in, the ethnicity, the race of the people likely to be coming in. And so that's it's well documented in the literature. Not many people will necessarily say that straight out if you ask them, but it's documented that that's another kind of motivating feature of opposition. And with the projects you mentioned specifically, so that's kind of part of the general, air of NIMBYism that you would kind of hear in these neighbors being opposed to these projects. But the project you mentioned specifically, because it's tied to this rather unique Texas law, the neighbors opposing it can also kind of make hey, we're actually just pointing out the problem with this Texas law. Like, Texas, you shouldn't be, or Houston, you shouldn't be using this law because this law kind of, it doesn't work that well. And so using that as a kind of more objective, I guess. I don't know the right.
Yeah. I was fascinated reading about this law, because I was like, man, that just seems like we've got this perfect answer now. It's going to be amazing. And then you're seeing
look at the details. Yeah, the law review articles written about it.
Right. The units aren't rent capped, so they they can say that they're affordable, but then because we have a housing shortage in general, they end up just being let to folks who might not have previously met an income requirement, but at the same market rate as the unit next door that's being advertised to the general public. Mm-hmm. And of course, if you have that situation, it could just be graduate students with student loans and who don't have incomes, but could easily afford the apartment, and taking advantage of programs like that. So there's all sorts of arguments against it that, I was kind of like, Tanglewood residents are opposing, and I was looking at the article like, they're going to say the quiet part out loud, and then it looks like this law is actually pretty flawed. So, interesting arguments all over the place there. With all that said, what do you think that the future for kind of affordable housing looks like in our city?
I mean, it is tough. Houston has an advantage over other cities because we don't have zoning. So there's one level of regulatory review that we don't have. And many other cities have actually been not taking away their zoning entirely, but amending their zoning, because many other cities have actually zoned so much of their land for single family homes only that they have realized they've tied their own hands in a way. And so they're rezoning some of their land for, multifamily, or at least small duplex type multifamily. And so Houston, in a way, is ahead of the game because we don't have to do that. We already have that as our baseline. We don't have that zoning problem or concern or layer. However, we still seem to have the housing shortages that many other cities have. I mean, we're a growing city, and it is just a really hard problem. And so one of the things that has been at the federal level actually happening is that the current administration is trying to put in place some carrots and sticks in terms of funding for communities to build more affordable housing. And so in a way to like make that appeal of federal funding and money in a way overcome the potential political resistance that there might be at the local level for, neighboring owners to say, no, NIMBY, we don't want this in our backyard, for like kind of like the pull of the federal money to outweigh the push of the no, not in our backyard. And so we'll see. I mean, this has kind of just been announced over the last year by the Biden administration. They're putting in place some of the rules to figure it out. That may be one way to try to, again, address this really intractable and long-standing challenge everywhere. But, we need more housing.
Yeah. On the plus side, I was reading an article just yesterday after we established our whole episode from the Kinder Institute, and it was saying that I think behind DFW, Houston pushed out the most new construction permits in the nation this last year. It's like more than Chicago, more than LA, more than New York City. And a lot of that growth was fueled by multifamily. Single family still in the lead, but a lot of new multifamily potential as well. So hopefully we can work it out with the market forecasts like we do as Houstonians.
So as we've discussed here, there are many tools that the government has at its disposal when it comes to land use. And alternatively, there are also many avenues for citizens to challenge the use of these tools. As kind of a closing bit, could you discuss a little bit about what a resident can do and how they might best go about doing, figuring out a change in their neighborhood that they have an issue with?
Yeah, so again, the land use process, even in Houston without zoning, the land use process has a lot of opportunities for public participation. The limits are that, sometimes you need to be paying a lot of attention to be aware when you, as a neighbor, have an opportunity for public participation. You have to, go onto the city website, figure out when that meeting might be, or read very closely. There sometimes is a posted sign outside of a property that might be applying for a particular change or permit from the city, and you can look on that and then correlate, like, okay, when's the meeting for this? So there can be a bit of a bar to entry, and the public participation that you might be able to have at the meeting itself, or the meetings itself, is often limited time-wise. So it's often a 3-minute interval in many cities. I think that's what Houston's is. So that can feel, it's an opportunity on paper, but it can feel a little bit limiting if you have kind of more concerns. And so in those cases, I tend to think that the most effective citizen advocates and community activists in land use as well as other areas, but land use particularly, are ones that are reaching out directly to like staff in their city council member's office, or if it's a some neighborhoods have like neighborhood associations, not HOAs necessarily, but like governmental type neighborhood associations. These historic preservation districts often have boards, and so reaching out to those, which again does require a little bit of lifting of legwork. You have to go onto the city website, figure out who to email, but they do have staff members, and the staff members' job is to respond to constituents. The city council members and the board members may respond to you directly. And so I think that can allow you more opportunity to kind of engage, not limited by a 3-minute limit, and to kind of get more details about, because you might kind of have a knee-jerk reaction to something and be like, oh no, I don't want that, I need to stop that. And then talking to somebody who's kind of more deeply involved in it can explain to you, you still might decide, no, I don't want that, but you'll have more details about like what this project is, why it's being proposed, things like that.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned the kind of the notice of public hearing. I'm picturing the big wooden billboard that they plant in the vacant lot, because there's going to be there's a variance request. And I have never once seen one of those on time. I saw one in my neighborhood the other day. I live over by the ballpark, and so there's a lot of new development on that side of town, and it's like, oh, I wonder what's going to go in this lot. It looks like it'd be perfect for an apartment building. I saw it was a variance request for multifamily, and it said notice of public hearing, March of 2020. I was like, that is 3 years ago.
Wow.
Still nothing on the lot. Billboard still standing. So
That's interesting.
I'll have to figure out who to email.
I saw one posted in my neighborhood for a restaurant, and the restaurant was already supposed to open, and it just got posted. So
Yeah, so it's not a perfect system. Yeah.
It's getting there.
Amazing. Well, Professor Zale, it's truly been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your knowledge on all these land use topics.
Thank you both for having me. This was a delight.
Yep. Thanks again for joining us, Professor, and we're looking forward to hopefully having you on the podcast again in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Emphasis Added is a podcast by the Houston Law Review. If you like what you saw, check us out on YouTube or your favorite podcast app.
Follow us on Instagram @EmphasisAddedPod and check out the Law Review at HoustonLawReview.org.